Hello, welcome to Sleepless Veteran. If you're here to rest, to let your mind settle while learning something quietly, you've found the right place. We tell military history slowly, without urgency, without drama, just facts unfolding at a pace that lets you breathe, that lets you process, that lets you drift if you need to. Tonight, we're going to Normandy, to France in 1944. To the weeks and months after D-Day, to the countryside beyond the beaches, to the fields and villages where the real campaign was fought, where Allied soldiers advanced slowly through landscape that was foreign, that was difficult, that was deadly. The Normandy campaign is remembered for the beaches, for Omaha and Utah, for the landings, for D-Day. But the campaign didn't end at the beaches. Extended inland, through countryside, through bocage, through maze of hedgerows and stone villages, through terrain that favored defenders, that made advance slow, that made casualties high, that made every field a battle, every hedgerow a fortress, every village a strong point. This is a story about what happened in that countryside, about what occurred in those fields, about what Allied soldiers did and what was done to them. Specifically, this is about snipers, about German snipers hidden in hedgerows, positioned in church towers, concealed in rubble, about the fear these snipers created, about the casualties they caused, about the terror they spread, and about what Allied soldiers did when they found these snipers, when they captured them, when they had them in their power. This is a story about executions, about prisoners killed without trial, about conventions violated, about rules broken, about brutality that occurred. That was widespread, that was common, that was systematic. This is uncomfortable history, is difficult history, is history that doesn't fit comfortable narratives about the good war, about liberation, about Allied virtue. But this is also a story about fear, about what terror does to soldiers, about how constant threat transforms men, about how rules break down under pressure of combat, under weight of total war, under burden of casualties and fear and hatred. This is a story about moral complexity, about gray areas, about situations where there are no good choices, only choices. This is a story that doesn't provide answers, provides questions, provides context, provides understanding of how ordinary men became executioners, how liberators became killers of prisoners, how conventions were violated by those who claimed to defend civilization. So settle in, get comfortable. What follows is calm, is steady, is documentary examination of what occurred in Normandy, of what Allies did to capture German snipers. We'll begin with a moment. With one execution, then we'll expand outward. We'll understand the terrain that made snipers deadly, the training that made them professional, the fear they created, the tactics developed against them, the context that made brutality possible, the pattern that emerged, the silence that followed, the questions that remain. This is history that is documented, that is verified, that occurred, that must be told. Not to condemn, not to excuse, but to understand, to see clearly, to confront what happened, to ask what it means. Let's begin. At a hedgerow, in Normandy, in summer of 1944, where a captured German soldier kneels, where Allied soldiers stand, where a decision is made, where an execution occurs, where history becomes uncomfortable, where questions begin. The German soldier kneels at the base of the hedgerow. His hands are behind his head. His uniform is Wehrmacht gray, is dirty from combat, from concealment, from days in position. The Allied soldiers stand around him. Our American infantry are from company that has been advancing through this sector for 3 days, are tired, are tense, are angry. The rifle lies on the ground nearby. His Mauser car, 98K. Has telescopic sight mounted. The scope identifies the rifle, identifies the soldier, identifies what he was doing, what he is. The soldier is sniper, was concealed in this hedgerow, was firing on American advance, killed 2 men before being located, before suppressive fire forced him from position, before he was captured, before this moment. The conversation among the Americans is brief, is not recorded, is not documented. But the pattern is known, is established, is what occurred thousands of times across Normandy. The identification is made. The soldier is sniper. The scope on the rifle proves this. The position he occupied confirms this. The casualties he caused verify this. The decision follows identification, is made quickly, is not debated extensively, is agreed upon. The sniper will not be taken prisoner, will not be processed, will not be sent to rear, will not survive this hedgerow. The decision that is made, that is common, that is how captured snipers are treated. That is what happens. That is what will happen now. The execution is quick. The German soldier understands probably, has seen the looks, has heard the tone, knows what is coming, doesn't resist, doesn't plead, doesn't try to escape, just kneels, just waits, just accepts. The American soldier steps forward, raises rifle, aims, fires. The shot is single, is sufficient. The German soldier falls, dies at the hedgerow, dies without trial, without processing, without adherence to Geneva Conventions, without protection of rules that are supposed to govern warfare. Dies because he was sniper, because he killed from concealment, because he created fear, because he was captured, because this is what happens to captured snipers in Normandy, because this is the pattern, because this is accepted, because this is normal. The Americans move on, leave the body, continue advance. The incident is not reported, is not documented, is not mentioned in after-action reports, is not investigated, is not prosecuted, is not punished, is forgotten immediately by official record, is remembered by those who were present, is carried by those who participated, is one moment among thousands, is one execution among many, is pattern that repeats. That occurs daily. That is how the campaign is fought. That is what Allies do to capture German snipers. That is the reality behind the liberation, behind the victory, behind the celebration, the execution at the hedgerow. That is common. That is systematic. That is what this story is about. This moment demands explanation, demands context, demands understanding how this became normal, how Allied soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, became executioners, how conventions were violated systematically, how rules broke down completely. The explanation requires expanding outward from this moment, requires understanding terrain, understanding snipers, understanding fear, understanding tactics, understanding context of total war, understanding breakdown of rules, understanding pattern that emerged, understanding silence that followed. The moment at Hedgerow is starting point, is question that demands answer, is execution that demands explanation, is crime that demands context. The moment that we will understand, that we will see clearly, that we will examine from all angles, that we will place in context, that we will comprehend fully. By the end, the moment at the hedgerow, the execution, the beginning, the question, that we will answer, that we will understand, that we will see as complex, as morally ambiguous, as product of conditions, as human tragedy, as war crime, as inevitable result, as all of these. The moment, the hedgerow, the execution, the beginning of understanding. The Normandy countryside was ancient. Was landscape shaped by centuries, by generations of farmers, by tradition of land division. The fields were small, were divided by hedgerows. The hedgerows were called bocage in French, were a distinctive feature of Norman landscape, were earthen banks, were topped with dense vegetation, with bushes, with trees, with growth that was thick, that was impenetrable, that created walls. The hedgerows were old, were centuries old, had been built gradually, had been maintained constantly, were 4 to 6 feet high typically, were thick at base, were dense at top, created barriers between fields, created divisions in landscape, created maze. The function of hedgerows was agricultural, was property boundary, was livestock fence, was windbreak, was erosion control. The hedgerows served farmers, served agriculture, served peacetime purposes, but served military purposes too, unintentionally. The hedgerows were natural fortifications, were ready-made defensive positions, were obstacles to movement, were barriers to advance, were cover for defenders, were concealment for snipers. The agricultural feature became military feature, became decisive terrain, became determining factor in campaign. The bocage that was normal landscape, that was unremarkable to French farmers, was nightmare to Allied soldiers, was paradise to German defenders, was landscape that determined tactics, that shaped combat, that made advance slow, that made casualties high, that made snipers deadly. The extent of bocage was vast, covered much of Normandy, extended from coast inland, covered invasion area, covered routes of advance, covered everything. The fields were small, were measured in acres, were hundreds of yards across typically, were divided by hedgerows on all sides. Each field was separate, was isolated, was individual battle. The hedgerows connected, created network, created maze that extended for miles. The landscape that had no long sight lines, that had no open areas. That was all close terrain, all divided terrain, all obstacles and barriers and walls. The bocage that was everywhere, that was continuous. That was what Allied soldiers faced after landing, after leaving beaches, after moving inland. The landscape they had to cross, had to fight through, had to advance across. The bocage that was ubiquitous, that was defining feature, that was decisive terrain. The villages added to defensive advantage, were stone construction, were Norman architecture, were buildings that were centuries old, were solid, were thick walls, were small windows, were perfect defensive positions. The churches had towers, had bell towers, had height, had observation, had fields of fire. The upper floors of buildings provided positions. The attics provided concealment. The rubble provided cover. The villages that dotted countryside, that controlled crossroads, that dominated approaches, were natural strong points, were fortified positions, were places where defense was easy, where attack was costly, where snipers thrived. The combination of bocage and villages, of hedgerows and stone buildings, of divided fields and fortified towns, created defenders' paradise, created landscape that favored those who held, that penalized those who attacked, that made advance difficult, that made snipers effective, that made casualties inevitable. The Germans understood this terrain, had occupied Normandy since 1940, since the conquest of France, had 4 years to study ground, to learn landscape, to identify positions, to prepare defenses. The preparation was thorough, was systematic, was professional. The Germans who knew every field, who had studied every hedgerow, who had identified every position, who had prepared thoroughly, who were ready. The occupation that gave them time, that gave them knowledge, that gave them advantage. The defenders who knew terrain intimately, who had prepared extensively, who were positioned perfectly, who were ready for invasion, who were ready to use terrain, who were ready to make advance costly, who were ready to employ snipers effectively. The German defensive strategy relied on terrain, relied on bocage, relied on making advance slow, making advance costly, making advance bloody. The strategy was not to stop invasion at beach, was to make advance inland so difficult, so costly, so slow, that allies would be worn down, would be exhausted, would be demoralized. The terrain was weapon, the bocage was barrier, the hedgerows were fortifications, the landscape was defense. The strategy that used terrain, that relied on terrain, that made terrain decisive. The Germans who positioned troops carefully, who placed strong points strategically, who employed snipers systematically, who used terrain to maximum advantage, who made every hedgerow position, who made every field battle, who made every village fortress, the defensive strategy that used landscape, that made Normandy difficult, that made advance slow, that made campaign costly, that made snipers deadly. The snipers in particular benefited from bocage. The hedgerows provided concealment, provided cover, provided positions. The sniper could position in hedgerow, could conceal completely, could observe without being seen, could fire without being located. The hedgerow that hid sniper perfectly. That made detection nearly impossible. That made counterfire difficult. That made suppression uncertain. The sniper in bocage was nearly invulnerable, was hidden completely, was deadly effectively, was difficult to counter. The terrain that made sniper warfare particularly effective. That gave snipers advantage. That made them deadly. That made them feared. That made them hated. The bocage that was perfect sniper country. That made snipers threat. That made them effective. That made them terror. That made them enemy that couldn't be seen, couldn't be found, couldn't be stopped easily. The landscape that made snipers deadly. That created conditions for sniper warfare. That made advance dangerous. That made casualties inevitable. That created fear. That produced hatred. That led to what came next, to what happened to captured snipers, to brutality, to executions, to violations. The landscape that made it all possible. That started the pattern. That created conditions, the bocage, the hedgerows, the landscape that made snipers deadly. The German sniper was not random soldier, was not infantry with rifle, was specialist, was trained professional, was product of system, of tradition, of doctrine. The German military had sniper tradition that was old, that was established, that was respected. The tradition that valued marksmanship, that emphasized individual skill, that recognized value of trained sharpshooter. The tradition that was maintained, that was developed, that was institutionalized. The German army that had sniper schools, that had training programs, that had dedicated instructors, that had systematic development of snipers, that created professionals, that produced specialists, that made snipers who were skilled, who were capable, who were deadly. The selection for sniper training was careful, was selective. Not every soldier was suitable. Not every volunteer was accepted. The requirements were specific, were tested, were verified. The physical requirements came first. The eyesight had to be excellent, had to be better than normal, had to be tested, had to be verified. The candidates sat for eye examinations, were tested for distance vision, for clarity, for color perception, for ability to distinguish shapes at range. The tests that were thorough, that eliminated many, that identified those with superior vision. The hand-eye coordination had to be superior, had to be demonstrated, had to be proven. The candidates performed tests, shot at targets, demonstrated accuracy, showed steadiness, proved capability, the coordination that was natural, that was innate, that couldn't be taught fully, that had to exist already. The physical fitness had to be adequate, had to meet standards, had to be maintained. The candidates who were examined, who were tested, who were evaluated, who had to demonstrate fitness, strength, endurance. The physical requirements that were first filter, that were essential. That eliminated majority of volunteers. That selected only those who were physically capable, who had potential, who could become snipers. The psychological requirements were equally important. were equally selective, were tested differently, were evaluated through observation, through interview, through assessment. The patience was essential, was tested, was required. The candidates who were observed during training, who were watched, who were evaluated, for ability to wait, to remain still, to endure discomfort, to maintain focus, the patience that was beyond normal. That was extraordinary. That was necessary for sniper, who would wait hours for shot, who would remain motionless for entire day, who would endure cramped position, who would maintain absolute discipline. The patience that was tested, that was evaluated, that eliminated those who were restless, who were impatient, who couldn't endure waiting. The discipline was required, was tested, was verified. The candidates who had to follow procedures exactly, who had to maintain standards, who had to demonstrate self-control, who had to show ability to follow orders, to maintain protocols, to function within system, the discipline that was absolute. That was unquestioning, that was necessary. The candidates who demonstrated this, who showed capability, who proved reliability, were accepted. Those who didn't were eliminated. The nerve was necessary, was evaluated, was essential. The psychological stability under stress, the ability to kill deliberately, to kill individuals, to kill from concealment, required specific psychology, required specific mentality, required nerve that was steady, that was calm, that was cold. The candidates who were evaluated, who were interviewed, who were assessed, for psychological fitness, for mental stability, for capability to function in role, to kill deliberately, to live with killing, to continue killing, the nerve that was tested, that was evaluated, that was essential, the psychological screening that was thorough, that was professional, that was necessary, that identified those who were psychologically suitable, who could function as snipers, who could kill repeatedly, who could live with role, who could be what was needed. The psychological screening that eliminated many, that selected few, that identified the capable, the suitable, the ones who could be snipers. The training began once selection was complete, once candidates were accepted, once they arrived at sniper school. The training that was extensive, that was detailed, that was comprehensive, that lasted weeks, sometimes months. That covered everything, that transformed soldiers into snipers. The marksmanship training was foundation, was primary skill, was what everything else built upon. The shooting practice began immediately, began with basics, with fundamentals, with position, with breathing, with trigger control, with sight picture, the fundamentals that were drilled, that were practiced, that were repeated until automatic, until perfect, until reliable. The shooting from various positions was taught systematically. The prone position first, was most stable, was most accurate, was primary position. The candidates learned to shoot prone, to position body correctly, to support rifle properly, to control breathing, to squeeze trigger smoothly. The practice that was constant, that was repetitive, that built muscle memory, that created automatic response. The kneeling position was next, was less stable than prone, but was useful, was necessary sometimes. The candidates learned to kneel properly, to support elbow on knee, to maintain stability, to control movement, to shoot accurately from kneeling. The practice that was extensive, that built capability, that created proficiency. The sitting position followed. Was compromise between prone and kneeling, was stable enough, was quick enough, was useful in various situations. The candidates learned to sit properly, to position legs correctly, to support elbows, to create stable platform, to shoot accurately while sitting. The standing position was last, was least stable, was least accurate, but was necessary sometimes, was practiced anyway. The candidates who learned to stand properly, to position feet correctly, to support rifles steadily, to minimize movement, to shoot as accurately as possible while standing. The positions that were all taught, that were all practiced, that were all mastered, that gave sniper flexibility, that enabled shooting from whatever position was available, was necessary, was possible. The range training progressed systematically, started at short range, at 100 meters, the distance where accuracy was easy, where fundamentals could be perfected, where mistakes were obvious, where correction was immediate. The practice at 100 meters that built foundation, that created confidence, that established baseline, then range increased to 200 meters, to 300, to 400. The distances increasing gradually, the difficulty increasing progressively. The candidates who practiced at each range, who learned to judge distance, to compensate for bullet drop, to account for wind, to make adjustments. The practice that was constant, that was repetitive, that built skill, that created capability. The range extending to 600 meters, to 800 meters, to maximum effective range. The practice at long range. The shooting where wind mattered greatly, where distance estimation was critical, where bullet drop was significant, where everything mattered. The practice that was extensive, that was demanding, that separated capable from exceptional, that identified best shooters, that created snipers who were deadly at distance. The weather training was essential, was realistic, was necessary. The shooting in various conditions was practiced. The wind was primary challenge, changed bullet trajectory, required compensation, required understanding. The candidates who learned to read wind, to judge speed, to estimate effect, to compensate correctly. The practice in various wind conditions, in light wind, in strong wind, in gusting wind. The learning that was experiential, that required practice, that developed over time. The rain was another challenge, affected visibility, affected equipment, required adaptation, the shooting in rain, the maintaining of equipment in wet conditions, the functioning despite weather, the practice that was realistic, that was necessary, that prepared for combat. The different light conditions were practiced, the shooting at dawn, at dusk, in bright sun, in overcast, the light that affected visibility, that affected sight picture, that required adjustment, the practice in various light, that built capability, that created adaptability, that made sniper effective regardless of conditions. The fieldcraft training was equally important, was equally thorough, was what kept sniper alive. The movement without detection was first lesson, was essential skill, was what separated living sniper from dead sniper. The candidates learned to move slowly, to move carefully, to move deliberately, to use terrain for concealment, to stay in shadows, to avoid silhouetting, to move when enemy wasn't watching, to freeze when enemy was alert. The movement that was art, that was skill, that was practiced extensively. The stalking exercises where candidates had to approach instructors without being seen, had to get within range, had to remain undetected. The exercises that were difficult, that were demanding, that most failed initially, that taught lessons, that built skill, that created capability to move unseen, to approach undetected, to position without alerting enemy. The camouflage was critical skill, was what made sniper invisible, was difference between life and death. The candidates learned to use natural materials, to gather vegetation from immediate area, to attach to uniform, to break up outline, to blend with environment. The camouflage that was specific to location, that used local materials, that matched surroundings exactly. The face painting that eliminated shine, that broke up recognizable features, that made human face unrecognizable at distance. The techniques that were taught, that were practiced, that were refined, the candidates who learned to become invisible, to blend completely, to disappear into terrain, The camouflage that was art, that was science, that was essential. That kept snipers alive, that made them effective, that enabled them to kill without being killed. The observation skills were taught systematically. The use of binoculars properly, the scanning techniques, the pattern of observation, the systematic search of terrain, the identification of targets, the recognition of enemy, the distinguishing of combatants from civilians, the observation that was skill, that required training, that was practiced extensively, the candidates who learned to observe without being observed, to see without being seen, to watch patiently, to maintain focus, to identify targets, to select victims. The observation that was foundation of sniping. That enabled everything else. That was what snipers did most. Watched, observed, waited. The skill that was taught carefully. That was practiced extensively. That was essential for success. The position selection was taught as tactical skill. The criteria for good sniper position were specific, were taught systematically. The field of fire was primary consideration. The position had to allow shooting at target area, had to provide clear view, had to enable engagement. The cover and concealment were necessary. The position had to protect sniper, had to hide sniper, had to enable survival. The escape route was essential. The position had to allow withdrawal, had to enable escape after shooting, had to provide way out. The candidates who learned to evaluate positions, to select best location, to consider all factors, to choose wisely, the tactical thinking that was taught, that was practiced, that was essential. That made difference between successful sniper and dead sniper. The working in pairs was practiced, the spotter and shooter relationship, the cooperation that was necessary, the communication that was essential, the spotter who observed, who found targets, who calculated range, who compensated for wind, who guided shooter, the shooter who focused on shooting, who maintained position, who controlled breathing, who squeezed trigger, the pair that functioned as unit, that operated as team. That was more effective than individual. The practice that built teamwork, that created cooperation, that made pairs effective. The working alone was also practiced. The independence was also necessary. The self-reliance was also essential. The sniper who might operate without spotter, who might work individually, who had to be capable alone. The training that prepared for both, that created flexibility, that made sniper capable in any situation. The equipment maintenance was drilled constantly. The rifle care was essential. The cleaning that was meticulous. The inspection that was detailed. The maintenance that was constant. The rifle that was tool. That was life. That had to function perfectly. The candidates who learned to care for rifle, to clean properly, to inspect thoroughly, to maintain constantly. The scope care was equally important. The optics that were delicate, that required careful handling. That had to be protected. The cleaning of lenses, the checking of mounts, the verification of zero, the maintenance that was essential, the care that was necessary, the attention that kept equipment functional, that kept sniper effective, that kept sniper alive. The culture within sniper units was distinct, was professional, was elite. The snipers who saw themselves as specialists, as professionals, as elite soldiers. The pride that existed, the esprit de corps, the mutual respect. The snipers who understood each other, who respected capability, who honored skill. The culture that valued patience, that valued discipline, that valued effectiveness. The culture that was different from regular infantry, that was more individual, that was more independent, that was more professional. The snipers who operated differently, who thought differently, who were different. The culture that was created through training, through selection, through shared experience, through mutual respect. The professional culture, the elite identity, the sniper mentality that was fostered, that was developed, that was maintained, that made German snipers effective, That made them deadly. That made them professionals. The German sniper who graduated training was product of this system, was result of selection, was outcome of training, was professional, was skilled, was capable, was ready, was marksman who could hit targets at distance, was fieldcraft expert who could move unseen, was tactician who could select positions, who could plan operations, who could function independently, was soldier who was trained, who was equipped, who was prepared, was specialist who was valuable, who was effective, who was deadly, the professional killer who was not monster, who was not criminal, was soldier, was doing job, was following orders, was defending, was using skill, was being effective, was creating casualties, was slowing advance, was accomplishing mission, was being what he was trained to be, what he was selected to be, what he was ordered to be. The sniper who was professional, who was soldier, who was man, who was German, who was defender, who was effective at killing, who created fear through effectiveness, who produced hatred through success, who would be hated for capability, who would be executed for doing job too well. The professional killers, the German snipers, the trained specialists, the skilled marksmen, who were positioned in Normandy, who were waiting in bocage, who were hidden in hedgerows, who were ready, who were deadly, who created terror, who produced hatred, who caused what came next. The professional killers who would be killed without mercy, who would be executed without trial, who would die as prisoners, who would become victims of their own effectiveness. The professionals, the snipers, the killers, who killed, who died, who are remembered here. The professional killers. The first Allied soldiers to encounter German snipers in Normandy learned quickly. Learned through death, through casualties, through sudden violence that came from nowhere. The soldier walking through field, moving carefully, alert, tense. The crack of rifle, the impact, the soldier falling, dead before hitting ground. The other soldiers diving for cover, scanning for shooter, seeing nothing, hearing nothing more. Just silence, just invisibility, just fear. The first encounters that taught, that demonstrated, that showed what sniper threat meant, that created fear, that spread fear, that infected everyone with fear. The physical manifestations of fear were immediate, were observable, were documented. The soldiers who were constantly alert developed visible tension, the muscles that were tight constantly, the shoulders that were hunched, the neck that was stiff, the physical tension that was exhausting, that wore men down, that created fatigue beyond what combat normally created. The hypervigilance was visible in eyes, the constant scanning, the rapid movement from point to point, the inability to focus on anything for long. The eyes that were always moving, always searching, always watching, the hypervigilance that was exhausting, that created eye strain, that produced headaches, that affected vision over time. The physical symptoms of constant alertness, of unending watchfulness, of perpetual vigilance. The sleep was affected profoundly, the soldiers who couldn't sleep soundly, who couldn't relax enough to rest, who remained partially alert even while sleeping. The sleep that was broken, that was interrupted, that was insufficient. The soldiers who woke at every sound, at every noise, at every movement, who were instantly awake, instantly alert, instantly afraid. The sleep that was never deep enough, never restful enough, never sufficient. The exhaustion that accumulated, that built over days, over weeks, that made everything harder, that made men less effective, that made reactions slower, that made mistakes more likely. The sleep deprivation that was weapon as effective as bullets, the exhaustion that was casualty as real as wounds, the lack of rest that wore men down, that weakened them, that made them vulnerable. The appetite was suppressed, the fear that made eating difficult, that made food unappealing, that created nausea, that produced revulsion. The soldiers who couldn't eat properly, who forced food down, who ate mechanically without tasting, who lost weight steadily. The weight loss that was universal, that affected everyone, that weakened men physically, that reduced strength, that decreased endurance, that made them less capable. The nutritional deficiency that was gradual, that was progressive, that was cumulative. The soldiers who grew thinner, weaker, less capable. The physical weakening that was product of fear, that was result of stress. That was what sniper threat created. The suppressed appetite, the weight loss, the physical weakening. That was weapon, that was effect, that was what fear did. The progression of fear through a unit was documented, was observable, was systematic. The first soldier killed by sniper created shock, created disbelief, created beginning of fear. The soldiers who saw body, who heard shot, who understood threat, became afraid. The fear that was initial, that was limited to those who witnessed, who experienced, who saw. The second casualty spread fear wider, affected those who hadn't witnessed first, who heard about first, who now experienced second. The fear that was spreading, that was moving through unit. The third casualty made fear universal, made everyone afraid, made threat real to all, made danger understood by all. The progression that was rapid, that took days, that infected entire unit. The fear that spread from those who experienced to those who heard, from witnesses to those who were told, from direct experience to shared knowledge. The contagion that was rapid, that was thorough, that was inevitable. The fear accumulated over days, over weeks. The constant low-level threat, the perpetual possibility of sudden death, the unending alertness, the continuous tension, accumulated, built, grew. The fear that was manageable initially became overwhelming eventually. The soldiers who could cope with threat initially couldn't cope indefinitely. The psychological reserves that were depleted, that were exhausted, that were gone. The coping mechanisms that worked initially failed eventually. The courage that was sufficient initially was insufficient eventually. The men who broke, who couldn't continue, who couldn't function, who were casualties psychologically, who were lost to combat effectiveness without being physically wounded. The accumulation of fear over time, the building of stress over weeks, the depletion of psychological resources over duration. That was process, that was progression, that was what extended exposure to sniper threat created. The attempts to cope with fear were various, were individual, were creative, were desperate sometimes. Some soldiers developed rituals, performed same actions before moving, said same words, touched same items. The rituals that gave sense of control, that provided feeling of agency, that made fear manageable psychologically. The rituals that were superstitious, that were irrational, that were necessary psychologically, that helped men function, that enabled men to continue. Despite fear, despite knowing rituals meant nothing, the rituals that worked psychologically even when meaningless, practically. Other soldiers sought companionship, stayed close to friends, maintained physical proximity, found comfort in presence of others. The soldiers who moved in groups when possible, who stayed together, who found safety in numbers psychologically if not practically. The companionship that made fear bearable, that made threat manageable, that provided psychological support, that enabled continuation, that made functioning possible. The bonds that formed, that strengthened, that became essential. The friendships that were psychological necessity, that were survival mechanism, that were what enabled men to continue, to function, to fight, despite fear. Some soldiers used humor, made jokes about snipers, about death, about fear. The humor that was dark, that was inappropriate, that was necessary. The jokes that released tension, that made fear manageable, that enabled men to continue. The laughter that was desperate, that was forced, that was therapeutic, that made unbearable bearable, that made impossible possible. The humor that was coping mechanism. That was psychological defense. That was what enabled function despite terror. Other soldiers became fatalistic, accepted death as probable, stopped fighting fear, stopped trying to prevent death, just accepted, just continued, just functioned mechanically. The fatalism that was surrender to fear, that was acceptance of probability, that was letting go of hope for survival. The fatalism that was actually helpful psychologically, that reduced fear by accepting worst, that enabled function by surrendering to fate. The soldiers who became fatalistic actually functioned better sometimes, were calmer, were steadier, were more effective. The paradox that accepting death made surviving more likely, that surrendering to fear reduced fear, that fatalism was effective coping mechanism. Some soldiers couldn't cope, broke down, stopped functioning, became psychiatric casualties. The soldiers who couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function, who shook constantly, who startled at every sound, who couldn't move from cover, who couldn't advance, who couldn't fight. The breakdowns that were progressive, that were gradual, that accumulated until function was impossible. The soldiers who were evacuated, who were sent to rear, who were treated by psychiatrists, who sometimes recovered, who sometimes didn't, who sometimes returned to combat, who sometimes didn't. The psychiatric casualties that were substantial, that were significant, that were cost of sniper warfare, that were effect of fear, that were what constant terror created. The men who broke, who couldn't continue, who were lost to combat effectiveness, who were casualties of fear as much as casualties of combat. The physical symptoms of chronic stress were documented, were observed, were treated. The soldiers who developed tremors, who shook constantly, who couldn't control hands, who couldn't perform fine motor skills. The tremors that were stress response, that were physical manifestation of psychological trauma. That were what fear created physically. The digestive problems were common. The stress that created stomach issues, that produced diarrhea, that caused vomiting, that made eating difficult, that created physical weakness. The cardiovascular symptoms developed, the elevated heart rate, the high blood pressure, the palpitations, the chest pain. The symptoms that were stress response, that were physical effects of psychological fear. That were what chronic terror created. The behavior changes were observable. The soldiers who became irritable, who snapped at comrades, who couldn't tolerate frustration, who overreacted to minor provocations. The irritability that was stress response, that was effect of fear. That was what chronic tension created. The aggression increased. The soldiers who became more violent, who used excessive force, who killed more readily, who showed less restraint. The aggression that was displacement of fear. That was expression of stress. That was response to feeling powerless. The behavioral changes that made men different. That transformed them. That changed who they were. The fear that changed behavior. That affected personality. That transformed character. That made men different from who they were, from who they had been, from who they would have been without this fear. The long-term effects were lasting, were permanent sometimes. The soldiers who survived, who went home, who lived, carried fear with them, carried tension with them, carried symptoms with them. The veterans who startled easily for years, who couldn't tolerate loud noises, who became anxious in certain situations, who avoided certain places, who were marked by experience, who were changed by fear, who carried it forever. The long-term psychological effects, the lasting trauma, the permanent changes, that were what fear created, that were cost of sniper warfare, that were price paid, that lasted lifetime, that never fully healed, that remained. The fear that was temporary during combat, that was permanent in memory, that lasted forever psychologically, that marked survivors, that changed them, that stayed with them, always. The invisibility was what made snipers terrifying. The enemy who couldn't be seen, couldn't be located, couldn't be identified. The artillery announced itself. The machine gun was visible when firing. The mortar could be tracked, but the sniper was invisible, was hidden, was camouflaged, was somewhere. The somewhere that was anywhere. That was everywhere. The sniper who could be in any hedgerow, in any tree, in any building, in any rubble. The enemy who was omnipresent potentially, who was nowhere visible actually, who was everywhere in fear, the invisibility that created terror, that made threat constant, that made every moment dangerous, that made every position exposed, that made every movement risky, the invisible enemy who was always present in mind, always absent in sight, always dangerous, always deadly, always feared. The personal nature of sniper killing created unique fear. The artillery killed randomly, killed whoever was in impact area. The machine gun swept areas, killed whoever was caught in fire. The killing was impersonal, was random, was statistical, but sniper killing was personal, was selective, was chosen. The sniper who looked through scope, who saw individual soldier, who aimed at him specifically, who pulled trigger deliberately, who killed him intentionally. The soldier who understood this, who knew he was being selected, was being aimed at, was being chosen for death, felt targeted personally, felt threatened individually, felt selected specifically. The personal nature that made sniper fire different. That made it more frightening, that made it more hateful. That created response that was personal, that was individual, that was specific. The personal killing that created personal hatred, that produced personal revenge, that led to personal brutality. The casualties from snipers were not high numerically, were not major cause of losses. Artillery killed more, machine guns killed more, disease killed more. But sniper casualties had disproportionate effect, had psychological impact beyond numbers. The one soldier killed by sniper, the two wounded. The company that took cover, that stopped advance, that was pinned, that couldn't move, that waited, that was delayed. The hours lost, the momentum stopped, the advance halted. By one sniper, by one man, by one rifle. The effectiveness that exceeded casualties, the impact that surpassed kills. The sniper who killed few, who affected many, who delayed advance, who created fear, who caused impact beyond what numbers suggested. The disproportionate effect, the outsized impact, the influence beyond casualties. That made snipers significant, that made them hated, that made them targets for revenge. The fear spread through units, through companies, through battalions, through divisions. The contagion was rapid, was thorough, was universal. The soldier who was killed by sniper. The soldiers who witnessed, who saw body, who heard shot, who felt fear, who told others, who spread fear, who infected others. The fear that moved through unit, that spread to those who hadn't been shot at, who hadn't seen sniper fire, who hadn't experienced it directly, but who heard about it, who learned about it, who feared it. The contagion of fear, the spread of terror, the infection of dread, that moved through Allied forces, that affected everyone, that became background reality, that became constant presence, that became part of environment. The fear that was everywhere, that affected everyone, that made bocage nightmare, that made advance ordeal, that made every field dangerous, that made every hedgerow threat, that made every moment tense. The fear that spread like disease, that infected like contagion, that sickened units, that weakened armies, that accomplished what snipers intended, that made sniper warfare effective, that created conditions for what came next, that produced hatred intense enough, that created rage sufficient enough, that generated desire strong enough, to execute prisoners, to violate conventions, to kill captured snipers without mercy, without trial, without hesitation. The fear that spread like disease, through units, through armies, through everyone. The fear of invisible enemy, of personal killing, of selected death, of sniper. The fear that defined bocage fighting, that shaped campaign, that changed soldiers, that created what came next, that produced treatment of captured snipers, that led to executions, to brutality, to violations. The fear that spread like disease, that infected everyone, that changed everything. The Allied response to sniper threat developed gradually, was not immediate, was not doctrinal, was learned, was adapted, was created through necessity, through experience, through casualties. The early days were confusion, were vulnerability, were helplessness. The soldiers who were shot at, who took casualties, who couldn't respond effectively, who couldn't locate snipers, who couldn't counter threat. The confusion that was initial response. That was first stage. That was before adaptation, before learning, before development of counter-tactics. The confusion that cost casualties, that cost time, that cost momentum, that had to be overcome, that forced learning, that necessitated adaptation, that created development of response. The observation was first countermeasure, was first step, was identifying sniper, locating position, finding the hidden enemy. The soldiers learned to watch, to scan, to search, the looking for signs, for muzzle flash, for puff of smoke, for movement, for anything that revealed position. The observation that was systematic, that was organized, that was assigned. The soldiers designated as watchers, as observers, as those responsible for spotting snipers. The watch that was constant, that was vigilant, that scanned continuously, that searched constantly. The observation that sometimes succeeded, that sometimes spotted muzzle flash, that sometimes saw smoke, that sometimes detected movement, that sometimes located sniper, that enabled response, that made counterfire possible, that identified target. The observation that was first step, that was essential step, that was necessary step, that made everything else possible. The suppressive fire was second step, was immediate response once sniper suspected, once position approximately identified. The response was overwhelming fire, was massive application of firepower, the artillery, if available, was called on suspected position, was fired in quantity, was designed to destroy position, to kill sniper, to eliminate threat. The mortars, if available, were used same way, were fired at position, were designed to suppress, to destroy, to eliminate. The machine guns always available, were turned on position, were fired continuously, were fired heavily, were designed to make position untenable, to force sniper to move or die, to eliminate position even if didn't kill sniper. The rifle fire from entire unit, everyone firing at position, everyone pouring fire, everyone contributing to suppression. The fire that was overwhelming, that was intense, that was sustained, that destroyed cover, that eliminated concealment, that made position unusable, that sometimes killed sniper, that usually forced relocation, that always eliminated position temporarily. The assault followed suppression, was third step, was completion of sequence. The infantry that moved forward after fire lifted, that advanced on position, that cleared position, that verified whether sniper was dead, whether sniper had fled, whether position was clear. The assault that was dangerous, that was necessary. That was how positions were cleared, how ground was taken, how threat was eliminated permanently. The assault that sometimes found dead sniper, sometimes found empty position, sometimes found sniper still present, still alive, still dangerous. The assault that resulted in close combat sometimes, in firefight at close range, in death on one side or both. The assault that was final step, that completed sequence, that cleared position, that eliminated threat, that moved advance forward, that took ground, that accomplished mission. The counter-sniper teams emerged as specialized response, were formed deliberately, were trained specifically, were equipped appropriately, were dedicated to hunting snipers. The teams that were allied snipers were trained marksmen, were professionals, were specialists, who hunted German snipers, who searched for them, who waited for them, who killed them, the teams that operated differently from infantry, that moved independently, that selected own positions, that conducted own operations, that hunted systematically, that watched patiently, that waited for opportunity, that killed deliberately. The counter-sniper teams that were effective, that reduced threat, that killed German snipers, that made advance safer, that made casualties fewer, that made progress possible. The sniper versus sniper duels were professional combat, were specialist versus specialist, were patient versus patient, were skilled versus skilled. The Allied sniper who positioned carefully, who concealed thoroughly, who watched constantly, who waited patiently, for German sniper, for shot, for movement, for anything. The German sniper doing same. Positioned carefully, concealed thoroughly. Watching, waiting. The duel that was ours sometimes, was days sometimes, was absolute stillness, was complete discipline, was tested patience. The duel where first to move died, where first to be careless died, where first mistake was fatal. The duel between professionals, between those who understood, who respected each other despite being enemies, who killed each other despite respect. The duels that were skilled, that were deadly, that were how best snipers were eliminated. By equals, by those who understood, by counter-snipers, the professional combat, the skilled warfare, the respect between enemies, that existed even while killing, that persisted despite hatred, that showed that snipers recognized other snipers, respected capability, honored skill, even while trying to kill. The effectiveness of countermeasures increased over time, over weeks, over months. The Allied forces that learned, that adapted, that became better at finding snipers, at suppressing snipers, at killing snipers, the casualties that decreased, the advance that became faster, the threat that became smaller, the German snipers that were still dangerous, were still effective, were still killing, but were less dominant, were less paralyzing, were less overwhelming. The adaptation that worked, that made advance possible, that reduced fear somewhat, that made progress achievable. The countermeasures that were developed, that were refined, that were employed, that made difference, that saved lives, that enabled advance, that changed situation from impossible to difficult, from paralyzed to slow, from helpless to capable. The learning to hunt the hunters, the development of counter-tactics, the adaptation to threat. That occurred. That worked. That made campaign possible. That also revealed something else. That showed what soldiers were willing to do. That demonstrated how far they would go. That indicated what they would become. The tactics that were developed, the methods that were employed. The countermeasures that worked, that also led to what came next. To what happened when German snipers were captured. To treatment that violated conventions. To executions that were systematic. To brutality that was common. The learning to hunt, that became learning to kill without mercy. That transformed from tactical adaptation to moral breach, from countermeasures to war crimes, from hunting to execution. The learning to hunt the hunters, that led to killing the captured. That produced brutality, that created pattern, that made executions normal. The adaptation that was tactical, that became moral failure, that crossed lines, that violated rules, that killed prisoners. The learning to hunt the hunters. The Geneva Conventions existed, were international law, were agreed upon rules, were designed to limit warfare, to protect prisoners, to require humane treatment, to prevent atrocities. The conventions that said captured soldiers were prisoners of war, were to be protected, were to be treated humanely, were not to be harmed, were not to be executed, were not to be murdered. The rules that were clear, that were explicit, that were agreed to by all parties, that were supposed to govern warfare. that were supposed to limit brutality, that were supposed to maintain some humanity in inhumane activity. The conventions that existed, that were supposed to apply, that were supposed to be followed, that were violated systematically in Normandy, that were ignored routinely, that were meaningless practically. The rules that existed, that didn't matter, that broke down completely. The process of breakdown was gradual, was not sudden collapse, was progressive erosion. The first violation was difficult perhaps, was questioned perhaps, was debated perhaps. The soldiers who captured first sniper, who identified him, who discussed what to do, who considered taking him prisoner, who followed rules, who processed him properly, who sent him to rear, the first captured sniper who was treated according to conventions perhaps, who survived capture perhaps, who became prisoner properly perhaps, the first who followed rules, then the second sniper was captured. The discussion was shorter perhaps, the consideration was briefer, the decision came faster, the execution occurred perhaps, the first violation perhaps, the first killing of prisoner, the first break in conventions, that was hard, that was questioned, that was justified with difficulty, that required rationalization, that needed excuse, that produced guilt perhaps, that troubled conscience perhaps. The first violation that was first, that was difficult, that was beginning. The third captured sniper, the fourth, the fifth. Each violation easier than last. Each execution less troubling. Each killing requiring less justification. The process that was progressive, that was normalizing. That was making acceptable what was criminal. The repetition that dulled conscience, that reduced guilt, that made routine what was violation. The soldiers who executed first sniper with difficulty, who executed fifth sniper easily, who executed 10th sniper automatically. The progression that was documented. That was observed. That was what occurred. The gradual normalization, the progressive acceptance, the incremental transformation of violation into normal, of crime into standard, of murder into procedure. The breakdown that was gradual, that was progressive. That occurred over time, over repetitions, over normalization, the process that transformed, that changed, that made brutal normal, that made criminal acceptable, that made violation standard. The role of alcohol was documented, was significant, was facilitating. The soldiers, who drank before combat when possible, who drank after combat always, who used alcohol to cope, to forget, to function, the alcohol that was provided officially. That was issued to troops, that was part of rations, the alcohol that dulled fear, that reduced inhibition, that made killing easier, that made violations more likely. The soldiers who were drunk, who were drinking, who had alcohol in system, were more likely to execute prisoners, were more willing to violate rules, were more brutal. The alcohol that lowered threshold, that reduced restraint, that enabled violations, that facilitated brutality. The drinking that was common, that was universal, that was part of combat, that contributed to breakdown, that made executions more likely, that enabled pattern, the alcohol as facilitator, as enabler, as contributor to violations, to executions, to brutality. The exhaustion played role. The soldiers who were tired constantly, who slept insufficiently, who fought continuously, who advanced daily, who were exhausted, made different decisions, had reduced judgment, had impaired thinking, had lowered inhibitions. The exhaustion that wore down restraint, that eroded conscience, that made violations easier, that made brutality more likely. The tired soldiers who couldn't think clearly, who couldn't judge properly, who couldn't maintain standards, who violated rules they would have followed when rested. The exhaustion that was weapon against conventions, that was enemy of rules, that was facilitator of violations. The tiredness that made men brutal, that made them executioners, that made them violators. The exhaustion that was universal, that was constant, that affected everyone, that contributed to breakdown, that enabled pattern, that made executions systematic. The commanders played role through tacit approval, through not preventing, through not stopping, through not prosecuting. The commanders who knew executions occurred, who heard reports, who understood pattern, who didn't investigate, who didn't prevent, who didn't punish. The tacit approval that was powerful, that was enabling, that was authorization without orders. The soldiers who understood commanders knew, who understood commanders allowed, who understood commanders approved tacitly, who felt authorized, who felt permitted, who felt executions were acceptable to command. The tacit approval that was never stated, that was never written, that was never ordered explicitly, but that was understood, that was communicated, that was real. The commanders who could have stopped pattern, who could have investigated, who could have prosecuted, who didn't, who allowed, who enabled, who approved tacitly. The command responsibility, the institutional guilt, the systematic enabling, that made pattern possible, that sustained pattern, that allowed pattern to continue. The peer pressure was powerful, was compelling, was coercive. The soldier who didn't want to execute prisoners, who wanted to follow rules, who felt uncomfortable, faced pressure from comrades, from unit, from everyone. The pressure to conform, to participate, to be part of group, to not be different, to not be weak, to not be soft. The soldier who refused to participate was questioned, was criticized, was ostracized sometimes, was considered unreliable, was considered weak, was considered problem. The pressure to conform was intense, was overwhelming, was difficult to resist. The soldiers who participated despite discomfort, despite conscience, despite believing it was wrong, because peer pressure was strong, because conformity was expected, because refusing was difficult. The peer pressure that enforced pattern, that maintained pattern, that made dissent difficult, that made participation expected, that made violation standard. The pressure from comrades, from unit, from everyone. That was powerful, that was compelling, that made pattern universal, that made participation nearly mandatory, that created systematic nature of violations. The desensitization was progressive, was documented, was observable. The soldiers who were horrified by first execution, who were troubled, who were affected, became less affected by second, less troubled by third, unaffected by 10th. The progressive desensitization, the gradual numbing, the incremental acceptance, that made brutal normal, that made shocking routine, that made horrible standard. The desensitization that was psychological adaptation, that was coping mechanism, that was what enabled continuation, that allowed repeated violations, that made systematic brutality possible. The soldiers who adapted, who numbed, who accepted, who became desensitized, to killing prisoners, to violating rules, to committing crimes, the desensitization that was necessary for pattern, that enabled systematic violations, that made executions routine, that transformed soldiers, that changed them, that made them capable of what they weren't capable of before. The progressive desensitization, the gradual transformation, the incremental change, that made executioners from soldiers, that made violators from men, that made criminals from citizens. The desensitization that was process, that was progression, that was what occurred. The context was total war, was war of annihilation, was war where everything was at stake, where survival was threatened, where civilization was threatened, where conventional limitations seemed absurd, seemed irrelevant, seemed luxuries that couldn't be afforded. The total war that Germany had begun, that Germany practiced, that Germany demonstrated, that eroded rules from beginning, that violated conventions repeatedly, that showed contempt for limitations, the total war that allies adopted, that allies practiced, that allies employed. The war where winning mattered more than rules, where survival mattered more than conventions, where victory mattered more than limitations. The total war that made rules seem irrelevant. That made conventions seem absurd. That made limitations seem impossible. The context that eroded rules, that broke down conventions, that made violations possible, that made brutality acceptable, that made executions thinkable. The German conduct in occupied France provided justification, provided rationalization, provided excuse. The 4 years of occupation, the treatment of French civilians, the reprisals, the massacres, the deportations, the executions, the SS killings, the Gestapo murders, the brutality that was documented. That was known, that was witnessed, that created rage, that created hatred, that created desire for revenge. The specific incidents were known, were discussed, were remembered. The massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, the village destroyed, the men shot, the women and children burned alive in church, the atrocity that was known, that created rage, that justified revenge in soldiers' minds. The reprisals against resistance, the hostages executed, the civilians murdered, the brutality that was systematic, that was documented, that was known, the German crimes that created justification, that provided excuse, that made Allied violations seem acceptable, that made revenge seem just. The Allied soldiers who saw evidence, who entered liberated villages, who saw destroyed buildings, who heard stories from French civilians, who learned what Germans had done, felt rage, felt hatred, felt desire for payback. The stories that were told, that were shared, that were believed, that created image of enemy who deserved no mercy, who had forfeited rights, who had earned brutality. The stories that were true, that were real, that were documented, but that were also used, that were also rationalization, that were also excuse, that made soldiers feel righteous about violations, about executions, about killing prisoners. The German conduct that was real, that was horrible. That was also convenient. That was also justification. That was also rationalization. That enabled violations. That made brutality acceptable. That created feeling that rules didn't apply to Germans, that conventions didn't protect those who had violated conventions. That brutality was appropriate response to brutality. The German conduct that was cause. That was also excuse. That was real justification and convenient rationalization. That was both. The specific rationalization about snipers was developed, was articulated, was believed. The sniper was not honorable soldier, was not fighting fairly, was hiding, was using concealment, was killing from ambush, was not engaging in fair fight, was not following rules of warfare, was assassin, was murderer, was criminal, was not entitled to protection, was not covered by conventions, was not prisoner of war, was enemy who forfeited rights by how he fought. The rationalization that was articulated, that was stated, that was believed. The soldiers who said this, who believed this, who used this to justify, who felt righteous because of this. The rationalization that was thin legally, that was wrong morally, but that was believed psychologically, that was used practically, that enabled executions, that justified killings, that made violations acceptable to those who committed them. The logic was flawed. The conventions protected all soldiers, protected those who fought in any way, protected prisoners regardless of how they fought. The sniper was legitimate combatant, was legal under conventions, was protected like any soldier. The distinction that was made was false, was rationalization, was excuse, but was believed, was maintained, was used. The false logic that enabled true brutality, the flawed reasoning that justified real crimes, the rationalization that was believed despite being wrong, that was maintained despite being false, that was used despite being invalid. The rationalization that worked psychologically even when wrong legally, that enabled violations even when unjustified morally. The logic that was flawed, that was false, that was believed, that was used, that made executions possible, that justified brutality, that enabled systematic violations. The breakdown occurred gradually, was not sudden, was not complete immediately, was progressive, was incremental. The first violations were isolated, perhaps, were exceptional, perhaps, were individual decisions, perhaps, but became pattern, became common, became normal. The violation that was once became violation that was routine. The execution that was once became execution that was expected. The brutality that was exceptional became brutality that was systematic. The breakdown that was gradual, that was progressive, that was complete eventually. The rules that were violated occasionally became rules that were ignored completely. The conventions that were bent became conventions that were broken. The limitations that were exceeded became limitations that were eliminated. The breakdown that transformed Allied soldiers, that changed liberators, that made executioners, that violated rules that existed for reason, that crossed lines that should not be crossed, that did things that should not be done. The breakdown that occurred in Normandy, that made treatment of snipers possible, that made executions systematic, that made brutality normal, that violated conventions, that broke rules, that killed prisoners. The breakdown that was gradual, that was progressive, that was complete, that was documented, that occurred, that must be understood, as context, as explanation, as making comprehensible. What happened, what Allies did, what soldiers became, when rules broke down, when conventions failed, when total war eroded humanity, when fear and hatred overcame restraint, when revenge overcame justice, when brutality became normal, when executions became systematic, when rules broke down completely. In Normandy, in summer of 1944, when Allies did what they did to capture German snipers, when rules broke down. Return now to executions, with full context, with full understanding, with knowledge of terrain that made snipers deadly, with knowledge of training that made them professional, with knowledge of fear they created, with knowledge of tactics developed against them, with knowledge of context of total war, with knowledge of breakdown of rules. Return to executions with complete picture, with full framework, with understanding of how this became normal, how this became systematic, how this became pattern. The executions that occurred throughout Normandy, that occurred across units, that occurred among all Allied nationalities, that occurred systematically, that occurred routinely, that occurred as pattern. That was how captured German snipers were treated. That was what happened. That was reality. The American forces treated captured snipers with execution. The pattern was established early, was maintained throughout. The American soldiers who captured German snipers, who identified them, who killed them. The 29th Infantry Division advancing through bocage, encountering snipers, suffering casualties, hunting snipers, finding snipers, executing snipers. The pattern that was repeated. That was systematic. That was common. The 1st Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 2nd Armored Division, the pattern across units, across divisions, across American forces. The captured German sniper who was shot, who was killed immediately, who was not taken prisoner, who was not processed, who was not protected by conventions. The American pattern, the American treatment, the American executions, that were common, that were systematic, that were normal. The British forces treated captured snipers identically. The pattern was same, was parallel, was universal. The British soldiers who advanced through bocage, who encountered snipers, who suffered casualties, who hunted snipers, who captured snipers, who killed snipers. The pattern in Operation Epsom, in fighting for Caen, in advance toward Falaise. The British units that treated captured snipers as Americans did, with execution, with bullets, with finality. The 50th Infantry Division, the 7th Armored Division, the Guards Armored Division. The pattern across British forces. The British treatment that was same. That was execution. That was systematic. That was normal. The British who killed captured German snipers, who did not take them prisoner, who violated conventions, who followed pattern, who did what everyone did. The Canadian forces were particularly harsh, were particularly brutal, were particularly systematic. The Canadian soldiers advancing through Norman villages, through camps, through approaches, encountering snipers in rubble, in buildings, in ruins. The Canadians who captured snipers, who identified them, who executed them, the treatment that was brutal, that was harsh, that was final. The Canadian forces that had particular hatred, that had particular rage, that had particular willingness to kill prisoners. The Canadians who treated captured snipers with execution, with brutality, with systematic killing. The pattern that was same, that was universal. That added to evidence, that confirmed that this was not isolated, was not exceptional, was systematic across all Allied forces, was universal practice, was how everyone treated captured German snipers. The methods varied somewhat, but outcome was same. Death. The most common method was shooting, was simple execution by rifle. The captured sniper who was shot, who was killed immediately, who died at point of capture. The shooting that was direct. That was simple. That was final. The method that was most common. That was standard. That was how most executions occurred. The simplicity that was efficiency. That was directness. That was killing without elaboration, without prolonging, without additional brutality beyond execution itself. The shooting that was common. That was standard. That was how most captured snipers died. The variations existed, were documented, were reported, were whispered about. The beatings before execution, the abuse before killing, the torture before death. The treatment that went beyond simple execution, that added brutality, that added cruelty, that showed hatred, that demonstrated rage, that indicated that some executions were not simple, were not quick, were not merciful even in brutality, were extended, were cruel, were torture. The reports that were incomplete, that were unconfirmed fully, that were disturbing, that suggested that some captured snipers suffered before dying, that some were beaten, that some were tortured, that some died slowly, that some died in pain beyond what simple execution would create. The variations that were minority probably, that were not standard probably, but that existed, that occurred, that added cruelty to crime, that added torture to execution, that made brutality worse, that showed depths of hatred, that revealed extent of rage, that indicated what fear and hatred created, what soldiers became capable of, what was done. The justification was stated sometimes, was articulated, was documented in oral histories. The captured sniper who was told why, who was accused, who was condemned, who was sentenced, who was executed. The statement that was made, the accusation that was leveled. You are sniper, you killed from hiding, you are not soldier, you are assassin, you are murderer. You deserve death, you will die. The justification that was spoken, that was believed, that made executioners feel righteous, that made killing feel justified, that made violation of conventions feel acceptable. The justification that was rationalization, that was excuse, that was false morally, that was wrong legally, but that was believed, that was stated, that was used. The justification that accompanied executions sometimes. That was spoken to victims sometimes, that was stated to comrades, that was maintained after, that protected executioners. Psychologically, that allowed them to live with what they did, that enabled them to continue, that made systematic execution possible. The justification that was stated, that was believed, that was maintained, that was part of pattern. The non-reporting was universal, was systematic, was deliberate. The executions that were not reported, that were not documented in official records, that were not mentioned in after-action reports, that were not investigated, that were not prosecuted, that were not punished. The silence in official record, the absence from documentation, the omission from reports, that was universal, that was systematic, that protected participants, that concealed crimes, that hid brutality, that avoided accountability. The official record that reported snipers killed, that counted bodies, that recorded casualties inflicted, but that didn't explain how, that didn't admit executions, that didn't document violations, that was sanitized, that was false, that was covering, the non-reporting that was policy unofficially, that was understood, that was practiced, that protected everyone, that concealed everything, that made pattern possible, that enabled continuation, that avoided consequences. The silence that was systematic, that was universal, that lasted during war, that continued after war, that persists partially still. The non-reporting, the silence, the covering, the concealment, that was part of pattern, that enabled pattern, that protected pattern, that made pattern systematic, that made pattern universal, that made pattern what it was. The executions, the pattern, the systematic killing, the universal practice, the common treatment, the normal response. To capture German snipers in Normandy by Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, all doing same, all executing prisoners, all violating conventions, all killing captured snipers. The pattern, the systematic brutality, the universal practice, the executions. That occurred, that were real, that were documented in oral history, that were concealed in official record, that were pattern, that were systematic, that were what Allies did to capture German snipers in Normandy. The pattern of execution. The identification of snipers was not simple, was not certain, was not reliable always. The German soldier who was captured, who held rifle, who was in position. Was he sniper, or was he regular infantryman? The determination that should have been careful, that should have been verified, that should have been certain, was often rushed, was often assumed, was often wrong, potentially. The problem of identification, that was real, that was significant, that was ignored, that was exploited, that created injustice within injustice, that killed men who were innocent even by brutal logic of sniper executions. The problem that no one wanted to discuss, that no one wanted to examine, that complicated narrative, that made brutality harder to justify, that revealed depths of injustice. The problem of identification. The scope on rifle was primary evidence, was most obvious indicator, was what identified sniper most clearly. The rifle with telescopic sight mounted. Was sniper rifle, was proof of role, was identification that was certain. The soldier captured with scoped rifle was sniper, was identified, was marked for execution. The scope that was clear evidence. That was definitive proof. That was undeniable indication, but was not complete picture. Not all snipers had scoped rifles all the time. Not all scoped rifles meant sniper. The ambiguity that existed, the uncertainty that remained, even with primary evidence, even with clearest indicator, the scope that was evidence, but was not proof absolute. That indicated but didn't confirm completely. That suggested strongly but didn't establish certainly. The scope on rifle. That was evidence. That was used. That identified. That marked for death. But that wasn't complete answer. Wasn't full picture. Wasn't certain always. The position where captured provided additional evidence, provided context, provided suggestion. The German soldier captured in position that was good for sniping, that had field of fire, that had concealment, that had cover, was possibly sniper, was probably sniper, was suspected sniper, the position that suggested, that indicated, That made likely. But that didn't prove. The infantryman could occupy same position, could be placed there by command, could be defending, could be doing duty. The position that was evidence, that was significant, that was considered. But that wasn't proof, wasn't certain, wasn't definitive. The position that added to picture, that contributed to identification, but that didn't confirm absolutely. That left uncertainty. That left possibility of error. That left chance of wrong identification. The position as evidence, as indicator, as contribution to determination, but not as proof, not as certainty, not as definitive answer. The testimony of captors was final factor, was determining often, was what made decision. The American soldiers who captured German soldier, who said he was sniper, who identified him as sniper, who accused him, who condemned him. The testimony that was sometimes accurate, was sometimes honest assessment, was sometimes certain knowledge, but was sometimes false, was sometimes mistaken, was sometimes deliberately wrong. The testimony that was suspect, that was potentially false, that was possibly excuse. The testimony that served purpose, that justified execution, that enabled killing, that was convenient, that was useful, that made possible what soldiers wanted to do anyway. The testimony that was evidence, that was used, that was relied upon, but that was also suspect, that was also questionable, that was also potentially false. The testimony that determined fate, that identified snipers, that marked for execution, that killed men, that was final factor in determination that killed. The testimony that was unreliable sometimes, that was false sometimes, that was excused sometimes, that killed innocents sometimes. The innocent victims existed, must have existed, cannot not have existed. The mathematics were certain. The identifications were rushed, were pressured, were made in fear, were made in anger, were made in hatred, were made wanting to execute, wanting to kill, wanting revenge. The identifications that were sometimes wrong, that were sometimes mistaken, that were sometimes deliberately false. Must have been. Must have killed men who were not snipers, who were infantrymen, who were regular soldiers, who were doing duty, who were defending, who were not snipers, who were identified as snipers, who were accused falsely, who were executed wrongly, who died innocent even by logic that said executing snipers was acceptable, who died because identification was difficult, because identification was rushed, because identification was wrong. The innocent victims who existed, who must have existed, who died, who were executed, who were killed wrongly. The injustice within injustice, the crime within crime, the murder within murder, the innocent who died, who were killed, who were executed, who are forgotten, who are unknown, who are unacknowledged. The innocent victims of identification problem, of rushed determinations, of pressured decisions, of wrong accusations, of false identifications. The innocent who died. The exploitation of identification difficulty was deliberate sometimes, was conscious sometimes, was way to execute anyone sometimes. The German prisoner who was inconvenient, who was burden, who was problem, who was hated, who was accused of being sniper, who was identified as sniper, who was executed as sniper. Whether sniper or not, whether guilty or not, whether accurately identified or not, the exploitation that was possible, that was practiced, that occurred. The identification difficulty that provided excuse, that provided cover, that provided rationalization for executing any German prisoner, for killing anyone, for expanding who could be killed. The exploitation that was abuse, that was injustice, that was additional crime, that made brutality worse, that made identification meaningless, that made accusations fatal regardless of truth. The exploitation that occurred, that is documented, that is admitted, that killed men who were not snipers, who were identified as snipers for convenience, who died because identification was exploitable, because system was corrupt, because brutality was systematic, the exploitation, the abuse, the additional injustice, the expanded killing, the identification difficulty that was real problem, that was also excuse, that was also tool, that was also weapon, that killed innocence, that expanded brutality, that made everything worse. The problem no one discusses, the identification difficulty, the rushed determinations, the wrong accusations, the false identifications, the innocent victims, the exploitation, the abuse, the injustice, the additional crime, the problem that makes brutality harder to justify. That reveals depths of injustice. That shows how systematic execution created conditions for greater injustice, for expanded killing, for more deaths, for more victims, for more crime. The problem no one discusses, the identification, the difficulty, the injustice, the innocent dead. The war ended. May 1945, in Europe. The fighting stopped. The dying stopped. The combat ceased. The soldiers who survived returned home, returned to America, to Britain, to Canada, returned to families, to communities, to normal life. The soldiers who had been in Normandy, who had advanced through bocage, who had fought snipers, who had captured snipers, who had executed snipers, returned home, became veterans, became civilians, became neighbors, became citizens, became honored, became heroes, became celebrated, returned to normal life, to peace, to forgetting, to silence. The soldiers who had executed prisoners, who had violated conventions, who had committed war crimes, returned home, unpunished, unprosecuted, unknown, protected by silence, by concealment, by forgetting. The silence was immediate, was total, was universal. The soldiers who participated in executions, who killed prisoners, who violated conventions, didn't discuss, didn't mention, didn't admit, didn't confess. The actions that were crimes, that violated international law, that could be prosecuted, that could be punished, were hidden, were concealed, were not spoken of. The silence that protected, that concealed, that enabled return to normal life, that prevented prosecution, that avoided consequences, that allowed participants to resume lives, to become normal, to forget, to be forgotten. The silence that was agreed upon tacitly, that was mutual, that was universal, that was maintained. The conspiracy of silence, about what was done, about how prisoners were treated, about how snipers were executed, about how conventions were violated. The silence that protected all who participated, that concealed all that occurred, that hid all that was done. The silence that was immediate, that was complete, that was maintained, that lasted. The official records were sanitized, were incomplete, were false partially. The after-action reports mentioned snipers killed, mentioned snipers eliminated, mentioned sniper casualties inflicted, didn't mention executions, didn't admit violations, didn't document crimes. The reports that counted bodies, that recorded kills, that noted casualties, but that didn't explain methods, that didn't describe circumstances, that didn't admit to what was done, the sanitizing that was deliberate, that was systematic, that was protecting, the official record that was incomplete, that was misleading, that was concealing truth, that was hiding crimes, that was enabling silence, that was preventing accountability, the records that exist, that are preserved, that are archived, but that don't tell truth, that don't admit reality, that don't document what occurred. The official silence, the institutional concealment, the systematic covering, that matched personal silence, that reinforced individual concealment, that created complete silence, complete concealment, complete protection, for all who participated, for all that occurred. The investigations never happened, were never conducted, were never attempted. The war crimes trials that prosecuted Germans, that prosecuted Japanese, that held enemies accountable, didn't examine Allied conduct, didn't investigate Allied violations, didn't prosecute Allied crimes. The trials that were for enemies only, that examined victors' justice, that prosecuted defeated, that didn't look at victors, that didn't examine Allies, that didn't investigate Allied soldiers, that didn't prosecute Allied crimes. The one-sided justice, the selective prosecution, the victor's prerogative, that examined German crimes thoroughly, that prosecuted Japanese brutality extensively, that ignored Allied violations completely. The investigations that never happened, the prosecutions that never occurred, the justice that was never sought, for Allied crimes, for violations of conventions, for executions of prisoners, for systematic brutality, for pattern of war crimes. The investigations that should have happened, that didn't happen, that never happened, that protected Allied participants, that concealed Allied crimes, that maintained silence, that enabled forgetting. The memory became selective, became partial, became constructed. The veterans who spoke decades later, who were interviewed, who told stories, were selective, were careful, were protecting themselves, were protecting comrades, were protecting memory, were protecting nation. The stories that were told were versions, were edited, were incomplete, were truth mixed with omission, were facts combined with silence, were admission combined with concealment. The veterans who admitted some things, who concealed other things, who told some truth, who hid other truth, who were selective about what they revealed, about what they admitted, about what they discussed. The memory that was constructed, that was shaped, that was controlled, that protected, that concealed, that revealed carefully, that admitted partially. The selective memory, the partial truth, the edited story, that was what was preserved. That was what was recorded. That was what became history. The memory that was selective, that was incomplete. That was protecting. That was concealing. That was maintaining silence. Even while speaking, even while admitting, even while revealing, the selective revelation, the careful admission, the protected memory. That told some truth, that hid other truth, that maintained silence about worst, about extent, about full scope, the memory that was selective, that protected, that concealed. The justification was maintained, was preserved, was stated when discussing. The executions that were admitted sometimes, were explained, were justified, were rationalized. The snipers deserved it, were not honorable soldiers, were assassins, were murderers, were fighting unfairly, deserved death. The justification that was maintained, that was believed, that was stated, that made participants feel righteous still, that made crimes feel acceptable still, that made violations seem justified still. The rationalization that persisted, that survived, that was maintained, that protected psychologically, that allowed participants to live with what they did, that enabled them to remember without guilt, to tell without shame, to justify without doubt. The justification that was maintained through decades, that was stated in interviews, that was preserved in oral histories, that showed that participants believed, that they felt righteous, that they felt justified, that they didn't feel criminal, didn't feel guilty, didn't feel wrong. The justification that persisted, that protected, that enabled silence, that maintained concealment, that avoided accountability, that preserved self-image, that protected memory. The justification that was maintained, that was believed, that was stated, that existed, that persists, that remains. The silence after, the concealment after, the protecting after, was systematic, was universal, was complete. The silence that protected participants, that concealed crimes, that avoided accountability, that enabled return to normal, that allowed honoring of veterans, that maintained image of good war, that preserved narrative of liberation, that concealed brutality, that hid violations, that covered crimes. The silence that was immediate, that was maintained, that lasted decades, that persists partially still. The silence that was conspiracy, that was mutual, that was agreed, that protected all, that concealed all, that hid all. The silence that was official, that was personal, that was institutional, that was individual, that was complete. The silence after the war, after the executions, after the crimes, after the violations, the silence that remains, that protects still, that conceals still, that maintains still. The silence after. The questions are not answered, are not resolved, are not settled. The execution of German snipers in Normandy, was it war crime? Technically, yes. The Geneva Conventions were clear. Prisoners were protected. Execution was prohibited. The violations that occurred were crimes under international law, were prosecutable offenses, were war crimes technically, legally, definitively, but morally. Context ally, practically. The questions are more complex, are less clear, are unresolved. The technical answer that is certain, the moral answer that is uncertain, the legal clarity that exists, the ethical ambiguity that persists, the questions about war crimes, about violations, about illegality, that have clear answer technically, that have unclear answer morally, that remain unresolved ethically. The questions about war crimes, the context matters, must matter, cannot not matter. The fear that German snipers created was real, was intense, was paralyzing sometimes. The casualties they caused were significant psychologically, were impactful beyond numbers, were creating terror. The personal nature of threat was selecting victims, was choosing targets, was killing deliberately, was creating hatred. The total war that was context, that was environment, that was reality. The German crimes that preceded, that justified revenge in soldiers' minds, that made brutality feel appropriate, that made execution seem just. The context that explains, that makes understandable, that shows how ordinary men became executioners. But does context justify? Does explanation excuse? Does understanding equal acceptance? The questions about context, about whether it matters, about how much it matters, about whether it changes evaluation, about whether it affects judgment. The context that is real, that is significant, that matters. But that may not justify, that may not excuse, that may not make acceptable. The questions about context, about what it means, about what it changes, about what it justifies, about what it excuses, that remain. The soldiers who executed. Were they criminals? Were they war criminals? Were they murderers? Technically, yes. Legally, yes. But were they victims too? Of circumstances, of fear, of hatred, of total war, of impossible situation? Were they men placed in conditions that transformed them, that changed them, that made them do things they wouldn't have done otherwise? Were they responsible? Are individuals accountable? Even in context, even under pressure, even in fear, even in hatred. The questions about individual responsibility, about accountability, about guilt, about judgment, that are difficult, that are complex, that are unresolved. Were soldiers criminals or victims, or both? Or neither? The questions that have no easy answer, that depend on framework, on values, on perspective, on judgment, that remain unresolved, that persist, that are asked but not answered. About soldiers who executed, who violated conventions, who killed prisoners, who were afraid, who were hateful, who were human, who were criminal, who were all of these. The questions about them, about responsibility, about guilt, about judgment, that remain. The commanders who allowed, who knew, who didn't stop, who didn't prevent, who didn't prosecute, who didn't investigate. Bear responsibility, bear accountability, bear guilt. The commanders who could have stopped pattern, who could have enforced conventions, who could have prosecuted violations, who didn't, who allowed, who tolerated, who accepted, who enabled. Bear greater responsibility, perhaps. Bear institutional guilt, bear systematic accountability. The commanders who were responsible, who were accountable, who were not held accountable, who were not prosecuted, who were not investigated, who were protected by same silence, by same concealment, by same covering. The questions about command responsibility, about institutional guilt, about systematic accountability, about who bears greater burden, who should be held more accountable, who failed more significantly. The questions about commanders, about responsibility, about accountability, about guilt, that remain. That are unasked mostly, that are unanswered completely, but that exist, that persist, that matter. The conventions themselves raise questions, the rules that are supposed to govern warfare, that are supposed to limit brutality. Do they work? Can they work? In total war, in existential conflict, in war where everything is at stake. Are rules possible? Are limitations realistic? Are conventions meaningful? When one side violates them systematically, when enemy commits atrocities routinely, when hatred is intense, when fear is overwhelming. Do rules survive? Can they survive? Should they survive? The questions about conventions, about rules, about limitations, about whether they are possible, whether they are realistic, whether they are meaningful. In war, in total war, in human conflict, the questions that are fundamental, that are philosophical, that are unresolved, about rules, about conventions, about limitations, about whether they work, whether they can work, whether they should be maintained, even when violated, even when broken, even when meaningless practically. The questions about rules, that remain, that persist, that matter. The comparison matters. German treatment of prisoners was often worse, was often more systematic, was often more brutal. Soviet treatment was worse. Japanese treatment was worse. The Allied violations in Normandy were limited compared to others, were less systematic compared to some, were less brutal compared to many. Does comparison matter? Does relative brutality change judgment? Does being less brutal than enemy excuse being brutal? Does worse existing elsewhere make this acceptable? The questions about comparison, about relative judgment, about context of other brutality, that are raised, that are relevant, that are also problematic. That risk relativism, that risk excusing, that risk justifying through comparison, the comparison that provides context, that shows this was not unique, that shows this was not worst, but that may not justify, that may not excuse, that may not make acceptable. The questions about comparison, about whether it matters, about how it matters, about what it changes, about what it justifies, that remain. The silence raises questions, the concealment raises questions, the lack of accountability raises questions, the investigations that never happened, the prosecutions that never occurred, the justice that was never sought, the selective prosecution of enemies, the ignoring of Allied crimes, the protecting of Allied participants, the covering of Allied violations, raises questions about justice, about victors' justice, about selective accountability, about unequal application of law, about protecting own while prosecuting others. The questions about silence, about concealment, about lack of justice, about selective prosecution, about unequal accountability, that are significant, that are troubling, that are unresolved, that persist, that matter. The silence that protected, that concealed, that avoided justice, raises questions about system, about justice, about accountability, about whether justice was served, whether justice was possible, whether justice existed. The questions about silence, about concealment, about lack of accountability, that remain, that trouble, that persist. The questions remain, are not answered, are not resolved, are not settled. The execution of German snipers in Normandy was war crime, was violation, was brutality, was also comprehensible, was also product of conditions, was also human response to inhuman situation. The questions that have no easy answers, that depend on values, on perspective, on judgment, on framework used. The questions that persist, that should persist, that must be asked. About war, about total war, about rules, about humans, about what we do, about what we become, about what fear creates, about what hatred produces, about what war makes possible, about what humans are capable of. The questions that are uncomfortable, that are difficult, that are necessary, that remain, that persist, that define this history, that make this history important. Not for answers, for questions themselves, for complexity, for ambiguity, for difficulty. The questions that remain, that should remain, that must remain, about what Allies did to German snipers in Normandy, about executions, about violations, about brutality, about context, about responsibility, about justice, about humanity, about war. The questions that remain.